The weight of a golden crown, they called him the king of waltzes, a man whose violin could make even silence weep. Andre Rieu filled the world's grandest halls with melodies so tender they seemed to heal the very air. Yet, behind the shimmering lights and standing ovations lived a man quietly bowing beneath the invisible weight of his own creation. Every graceful smile concealed exhaustion, every encore echoed with the loneliness of unspoken memories. Andre Rieu's fortune, estimated at over 600 million, is staggering. Yet behind the gold lies a man forged by struggle. His 15th-century Maastricht castle is not merely a monument to success but a sanctuary built from perseverance and pain. Within its walls, he writes, rehearses, and dreams, surrounded by priceless violins and echoes of a life spent chasing beauty at all costs. His empire stretches across 80 properties in Europe, fleets of custom vehicles, and more than 100 employees whose livelihoods depend on his vision. Every note he plays pays not just for grandeur, but for the crushing responsibility that never sleeps. Even when the stage lights dim, the bills remain. Salaries, logistics, tour costs, and million-dollar insurance premiums flow endlessly. The empire hums like a flawless orchestra, powered by his relentless will. But each dollar of that wealth carries a hidden price: sleepless nights, lost years with family, and the silent ache of perfection. Because this was never a story about fortune, it's a story about endurance, about a man who turned rejection into rhythm and sorrow into song. And if his waltzes have ever lifted you through pain, perhaps leave a whisper of gratitude below. For every soul his music has touched, Andre Rieu gave a piece of his own. Long before the applause, there was only a boy waiting in silence for his father to look up and smile. He never did. Andre Rieu was born in 1949 into a home where music filled the air, but love never did. His father, a celebrated conductor, ruled the household with the precision of a metronome, while his mother remained distant, detached, and cold. Their home was immaculate and disciplined, beautiful to the ear, barren to the heart. Years later, Andre would say with quiet finality, "My parents didn't love me. That's not a feeling. That's a fact." As a boy, he would sit at the edge of the rehearsal room, watching his father conduct orchestras with sweeping authority. His small hands would mimic those movements, not in admiration, but in longing. For a glance, a word, a smile. None came. In that house, affection was a foreign language. When he finally gathered the courage to confess his dream of becoming a musician who played not for perfection but for joy, his father scoffed. In the elder Rieu's rigid world, music was about mastery, not happiness. That single rejection carved itself into Andre's soul like a scar. It was in that emotional silence that he found his truest friend, the violin. To others, it was an instrument. To Andre, it was a confidant. Late at night, when the house stood still, he would draw the bow across the strings, coaxing out the tenderness his family never gave. It wasn't practice, it was survival. The violin became his voice when no one would listen. The rejection continued beyond home. At the Royal Conservatory of Brussels, Andre was told that feeling had no place in music. Technique ruled emotion was weakness. He didn't lack skill, he simply played with too much heart. He called those years invisible bruises. Yet from that pain, rebellion was born. In 1978, without blessing or backing, Andre founded the Maastricht Salon Orchestra, a one-man revolution against cold tradition. "I wasn't born in warmth," he said, "but I chose to create it." And that choice changed the world. By the age of 29 in 1978, armed only with his unshakable belief, years of disciplined training, and a small group of kindred spirits, he walked away from that secure but stifling world. He formed the Maastricht Salon Orchestra, a humble ensemble that dared to infuse classical music with warmth, humor, and intimacy. It was a heartbreaking yet quietly liberating decision, the kind of choice that wounds you first and then ultimately saves you. By Andre Rieu's side was Marjorie, the woman whose quiet strength and unshakable belief never wavered. When the world doubted him, she didn't. Their love, however, ignited fierce resistance. His family, bound by formality and tradition, refused to accept her. His mother's rejection of their marriage severed the final fragile thread connecting him to his past. The estrangement would last a lifetime, a wound that never truly healed. Yet from that pain came a liberating truth: the freedom to create a life, a marriage, and a sound unshackled by anyone's approval. Those early years together were built not on privilege, but on passion and faith. Small halls, modest crowds, and applause that barely filled the room. But every concert carried something priceless. In those moments, Rieu wasn't just playing music, he was sharing joy and receiving it back like light reflecting off water. Years later, he would look back on those nights with quiet reverence, calling them the purest music I ever made. They were not just performances, they were the birth of a new way to live, love, and listen. By 1987, after years of rejection and relentless effort, Rieu stood before his greatest gamble. At 38, he risked everything to form the Johann Strauss Orchestra, just 12 musicians bound by his impossible dream. The classical establishment laughed. Critics dismissed it as a novelty, a sentimental sideshow. But Andre's vision burned too bright. Silence weep, Andre resistance. He dreamed of tearing down the icy walls that had trapped classical music for centuries, replacing them with warmth, laughter, and human connection. The early years were anything but romantic. Ticket sales barely covered expenses. Some nights ended in ovations, others, in silence and debt. He poured his savings into instruments, travel, and wages. Each concert was a wager against ruin. After the orchestra's debut on January 1, 1988, he returned to a cheap hotel room, ledger in hand, heart full and pockets empty. Still, he refused to quit. He was no longer chasing fame. He was protecting something sacred. The dream had begun to breathe, and he would not let it die. Yet, it was in these moments of intense pressure that his signature style took root. Every bow stroke carried not just melody, but the defiance of a man determined to make beauty accessible to anyone willing to listen. Looking back decades later, Rieu would say those nights taught him that joy was worth more than any ticket price, a lesson that reshaped his approach to every performance thereafter. Slowly, the seeds he planted began to sprout. Audiences grew, media began to take notice, and the orchestra's reputation stretched beyond the Netherlands. Yet even then, success felt fragile, earned inch by inch, city by city, applause by applause. This was the moment when art and livelihood began to converge, the humble foundation upon which he would one day build a multi-million-dollar empire. But it was a kingdom forged from grit, not glamour, from the long, weary miles between cities, from the heartbreak of being dismissed, and from the stubborn, unquenchable fire of a man who refused to let the music he loved belong only to the elite. The rise of the king of waltzes. By the mid-1990s, Andre Rieu's relentless determination began to bear fruit, though not in the effortless, glamorous way some might assume. His rise to global fame was carved from years of calculated risks, sleepless nights, and an unyielding refusal to surrender under the weight of doubt. The turning point came in 1995 during a UEFA Champions League match, where his performance of Shostakovich's Waltz 2 before a vast stadium audience created a wave of emotion that transcended borders. Sales of the recording soared. But behind that triumph was a man who had spent decades honing a sound that could melt the hearts of lifelong classical aficionados and complete newcomers alike. From that moment, Rieu embarked on relentless world tours that took him and his orchestra across Europe, the United States, Australia, and Asia. These journeys were not without strain. The complex logistics across continents, the gamble of filling massive arenas in places where classical music was a rarity, and the immense responsibility of safeguarding the welfare of over 100 people who depended on him. The title, King of Waltzes, was not a gift. It was a crown forged night after night, encore after encore, until audiences from Tokyo to New York swayed in unison to his music. Rieu knew that true success required more than applause. He meticulously constructed an independent empire, controlling every aspect from production to promotion. He built his own studio to ensure creative freedom and assembled an in-house team capable of staging unforgettable spectacles. Every choice carried risk, every investment a leap of faith. Yet the rewards, measured not only in wealth but in the unprecedented scope of his reach, proved that his instincts were profoundly right. His investments told their own story. Rieu secured dozens of properties, many nestled in his cherished Maastricht, each with a specific purpose: housing staff, storing instruments, or serving as operational hubs. His resources stretched further: a fleet of specialized vehicles for safe instrument transport, personal chefs to sustain his team's health, and even a private nursery so that musicians could travel with their children without sacrificing family bonds. These were not indulgences, but deliberate, strategic moves to protect the heart of his enterprise, his orchestra. To the public, the image was all sparkles, sold-out arenas, golden light glinting off chandeliers, and the sweep of strings filling the air. Hidden from view were the grueling rehearsals in unfamiliar cities, the solitary hours poring over accounts to ensure every player was paid, and the delicate balance of keeping his music pure while managing the colossal machinery of a global business. His empire was no inheritance, it was built one note at a time, with precision, patience, and immense sacrifice. By the time Andre Rieu commanded the world stage, his success was a testament not to ease or privilege, but to the grit and devotion of a man who refused to let his dream die, no matter how high the cost. The castle, the Stradivarius, the soul among Andre Rieu's many possessions, none carry as much weight in memory and meaning as his castle and his rare collection of Stradivarius violins. The 15th century castle in Maastricht was more than stone walls and history. It was the place where, as a boy, he first sat at a piano and let his fingers discover the magic of music. In 1999, after decades of dreaming, he purchased the property and began a careful restoration, not to turn it into a cold monument, but into a living space where music could breathe. Every arch and corridor was revitalized with his touch, blending heritage with the pulse of his creative life. The castle became both sanctuary and workplace, housing a glass conservatory filled with light, a lush tropical garden where he could escape the demands of touring, and a fully equipped recording studio where some of his most moving pieces came to life. Walking through its halls, one could feel the intersection of past and present, the echoes of a boy's first notes mingling with the mastery of a world-renowned conductor. Equally treasured were his two rare Stradivarius violins dated 1667 and 1732. These instruments were not merely tools of his trade, they were companions, each with a soul shaped by centuries of music. Rieu spoke of them with reverence, aware that their voices were unlike any other. In moments of crisis, their significance deepened. In the dark days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when performances halted and the financial weight of sustaining his orchestra threatened to crush the entire enterprise, he even considered selling one to keep his musicians employed. It was a decision he never had to carry out, but the thought itself revealed the depth of his commitment. For Rieu, these possessions were never about display. They were repositories of memory, symbols of perseverance, and testaments to a life where art and sacrifice were inseparable. The castle was a reminder of where he began. The Stradivarius violins were reminders of the timeless craft he had devoted himself to. They formed a legacy not just of wealth, but of the profound bond between a man, his music, and the tangible treasures that had shared his extraordinary journey. The silent pandemic and profound sacrifice of 2020. The year 2020 brought Andre Rieu to a kind of silence he had never known, a silence so sudden and absolute it felt almost cruel. As the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, every tour date, every grand performance, every night beneath glittering lights vanished from the calendar in what felt like a single merciless heartbeat. For decades, his life had been measured in rehearsals, ovations, and the constant rhythm of travel. Now, the man whose music had filled stadiums and concert halls stood in the haunting stillness of an empty stage. It was heartbreaking, truly, achingly so, and yet his first thought was not of his own loss, but of the more than 100 musicians, technicians, and staff whose livelihoods hung by a thread. Month after month, as his own income collapsed, he reached deep into his reserves to pay their salaries, refusing to abandon the family he had built with his own hands. The financial strain was relentless, gnawing at him in the small hours when sleep would not come. He would lie awake, staring into the dark, wondering how much longer he could keep the lifeline intact. The numbers never seemed to add up. The future felt like a narrowing tunnel with no clear light ahead. Even his most treasured possessions, the symbols of a lifetime's work, became potential sacrifices. His 1732 Stradivarius, a priceless partner that had sung beside him for decades, came perilously close to leaving his hands so his orchestra could survive. Smaller investments were liquidated quietly. A cherished vintage vehicle from his collection was sold without a word. Personal savings drained away to keep his people secure. That he could even contemplate parting with these pieces of his soul spoke volumes about his loyalty, his courage, and the immense weight of his responsibility. The castle that once pulsed with laughter, rehearsals, and the hum of creation fell into a haunting stillness. The hallways echoed with absence. Every room seemed to hold its breath. Through those long months of lockdown, Rieu lived in near total solitude, the world outside his gates frozen in fear. And yet, even in that suffocating quiet, he turned to composition. What emerged from his pen was unlike anything he had written before, slower, richer, and steeped in a gratitude that could only be forged in deprivation. Later, he would confess, "When you are forced to stop, you understand what music truly means to you. Every note becomes a gift, and every silence a lesson." The weight of those months never left him. When at last the world began to open and he stepped onto a stage for the first time in over a year, the applause that rose to meet him was different, less a celebration than a collective sigh of relief. A reunion of hearts that had been apart too long. Many in the audience wept openly, their own private battles during the pandemic reflected in the lines of his face and the tenderness in every phrase he played. From that night onward, every performance carried the ghost of that silence. His waltzes became softer, crescendos more tender, each bow stroke a mingling of thank you and prayer. What returned to the stage was not merely a conductor, but a man who had walked through fear, sacrifice, and the loneliness of an empty hall, and emerged with the unshakable truth that music, no matter how suffocated, will always find its breath again. And so would he. The unseen battles, illness, loss, and mortal limits. By 2010, Andre Rieu had already endured decades of relentless schedules, sleepless flights, and stages that seemed to stretch endlessly across continents. Yet nothing prepared him for the moment his own body turned against him. A vicious virus invaded his inner ear, stealing his balance like a thief in the night, leaving him swaying on solid ground as if the earth itself had shifted beneath him. Concerts months in the making were canceled, heartbreaking letters from disappointed fans pouring in, some pleading for him to recover quickly, others simply sending prayers. Audiences waited in vain, unaware that behind the curtain their beloved Maestro fought waves of nausea and vertigo just to remain upright. For a man whose life had been defined by movement, the forced stillness was suffocating, an invisible prison with no bars. He clawed his way back inch by inch, practicing alone in the early hours, willing his fingers to hold the bow steady, forcing the music to anchor him when the world spun violently around him. Nights were sleepless, haunted by the fear that his career and the orchestra depending on him could vanish overnight. Friends recall him pacing the halls of his home at 300 a.m. bow in hand, whispering to himself, "I must come back," the sound of his steps echoing like a metronome marking time against despair. Then came 2016, a year that would wound his heart in a way no illness could. Ruud Merckx, his trusted trombonist and closest friend, collapsed without warning in the midst of a tour. One day, they shared laughter in a cramped dressing room. The next, Ruud was gone forever. That night, Andre took the stage, but the lights felt colder, the ovation emptier, each cheer sounding like an echo in a hollow room. Every glance toward Ruud's spot was like reaching for a hand that would never again be there. It was like losing a limb, he would later admit, his voice breaking. For months, he carried that absence into every waltz, each note aching with remembrance. He began dedicating quiet moments in his concerts to his friend, never announced, but deeply felt. On some nights, he would linger an extra beat on a final note, eyes glistening, the audience unaware that it was for Ruud, as if keeping him alive through music. In interviews, he would speak softly about their last conversation, recalling how Ruud had joked about the next city they'd visit, never imagining he wouldn't be there. By 2024, years of pushing beyond human limits finally exacted their price. In Mexico, moments before stepping onto a stage set for 40,000 eager fans, his body surrendered. He collapsed backstage, the roar of the crowd melting into a distant hum. The show was canceled, the first time in his career he could not rise for his audience. Paramedics surrounded him, the bright glare of medical lights replacing the warm glow of the stage. In the uneasy quiet that followed, he turned to Marjorie, his voice trembling, and whispered, "I don't ever want to have another opening night like this again." It wasn't merely exhaustion, it was the raw truth of a man staring into the limits of his own mortality, aware that the curtain could fall for good at any moment. That night, as the stadium emptied, he lay in a darkened hotel room, listening to the silence, feeling the absence of music like a weight on his chest, questioning whether his body could still bear the burden of his art. His phone remained on the bedside table, dozens of messages from fans and friends unanswered, as he stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was the moment to stop. Yet, even in the darkest corners of these crises, Andre's resolve refused to break. He forced himself into grueling rehabilitation after the virus, despite the dizzying fear of collapsing mid-performance. He carried Ruud's memory into every concert, sometimes glancing toward that empty space for courage, drawing strength from the pain. And in Mexico, as the weight of years bore down, he made a vow if his body were to fail again, it would only be after giving the very last note he had left. He began adjusting his tours, building in more rest days, yet still pushing himself to deliver the magic his audiences expected. The cost of greatness had never been higher, the pain never sharper. But neither had his devotion to the music, the orchestra, and the millions who had stood by him through every note, every ovation, and every silence in between. He knew that the music, like life, could stop at any time, and so he played as if each performance might be his last. Every bow stroke a defiance against time itself, every standing ovation a reminder that the struggle had been worth it. The unshakable Pillars family and future Marjorie has been the unshakable anchor of Andre's life. The quiet architect behind the empire, managing schedules, negotiating contracts, writing arrangements, and holding the fabric of the orchestra together from the very beginning. Often sacrificing her own dreams to keep us alive. She has stood through the storms, financial uncertainty, grueling tours, the dark silence of the pandemic, always shielding Andre from distractions so he could pour his soul into the music. Pierre, their son, grew up backstage among violins and sheet music, absorbing the rhythm of rehearsals and the discipline of performance. Now he stands as the vigilant guardian of his father's well-being and the orchestrator of every performance, meticulously planning tours, rehearsals, and even moments of rest so Andre can continue to grace the stage without breaking under the weight of years. He has been the first to see the toll a standing ovation can take, the first to notice when fatigue creeps into his father's bow hand. Then there is Daisy, the granddaughter whose delicate fingers on the piano keys symbolize the passing of a torch across generations, embodying the family's philosophy. One never forced them. If music chooses them, they will come. Her presence is a reminder that the music will outlive the man, that the echoes of his melodies will find new hands and new hearts to carry them forward, a legacy beyond wealth. Today, in August 2025, Andre resides in a lovingly maintained 150-year-old home near his treasured 15th century castle, the place where, as a boy, he once learned piano. The castle remains a working hub for music and memories, but his home offers the stillness his body now craves. The walls hold shelves of scores and mementos from decades on the road, each with a story, each paid for in sleepless nights and hard-earned applause. He no longer tours outside Europe, yet his calendar remains full, recently returning from his sold-out July 2025 Maastricht concerts where thousands filled the square in a celebration of survival, resilience, and love for his art. Each performance was prepared with the precision of a man who knows he must guard every ounce of strength. His days are carefully structured dawn walks in the gardens, light stretching with a personal trainer, a diet curated by his chef and doctor to sustain his waning stamina, and regular health checks to manage the inevitable toll of age. Afternoons often find him in his private studio, coaxing new life from the violin or reviewing arrangements, while evenings are for quiet dinners with Marjorie, Pierre, and Daisy, where laughter replaces the roar of applause. Though he has not yet spoken publicly of a will, his family understands that the truest inheritance he plans to leave is not his fortune, his properties, or even his priceless Stradivarius violins. It is the body of work and the moments that defined it. His net worth, scattered across properties, instruments, investments, and royalties, is substantial, yet it pales beside the legacy of connection his music has built. Time has left his health more fragile, his energy more finite, and each bow drawn feels like it could be the last. He carries the private griefs of lost friends and the weight of years spent in constant motion, tempered now by a slower pace and deeper gratitude. The echoes of the July concert still linger, a reminder that even after decades, the bond between artist and audience can grow stronger. The man who once faced rejection, ridicule, and isolation now plays for crowds that feel like family. And when the final note fades, his legacy will be measured not in wealth, but in the countless hearts that beat in time to his waltzes. If one of those melodies has ever carried you through your own nights of grief or days of joy, leave your tribute below, because every word of thanks becomes another note in the eternal symphony he leaves behind. As the curtain slowly falls on the extraordinary journey of Andre Rieu, the legacy he leaves behind is not just counted in the value of his estates, the rare instruments he cherished, or the vast wealth amassed over decades. It is written in the countless hearts that his music has touched. His waltzes have been the soundtrack to love stories, farewells, and moments of quiet reflection across generations. Every performance was an act of giving, every note a bridge between people who might otherwise have remained strangers. His life reminds us that the truest measure of wealth is not in what we possess, but in what we inspire in others. Today, as his family looks upon the empire he built, with its grandeur, its beauty, and its unspoken sacrifices, they see more than an artist. They see a man who gave his youth, his health, and his heart to keep music alive in a changing world. And they understand that the real inheritance is the courage to dream beyond limits, to persevere when the stage feels empty, and to love what you do so fiercely that it becomes your gift to the world. If Andre's music has ever walked with you through joy or loss, if his melodies have ever eased your burdens or lit your spirit, share your memory below. Even a simple message, a single word, is a way to honor the man whose bow danced across strings and found its way into our souls.